It was a typical Monday afternoon at Horizon National Bank in downtown Atlanta. The large, pristine lobby buzzed with quiet activity, employees answering phones, heels clicking against polished marble floors, and faint murmurs of clients discussing transactions. Sunlight poured through the tall glass windows, reflecting off the bank's sleek modern interior. At the center of it all, Richard Ward, the branch manager, sat in his glass-walled office. He was a man of 52, with a sharp jawline, thinning blonde hair slicked back, and piercing blue eyes that rarely softened. His neatly pressed gray suit and pristine white shirt mirrored his rigid personality. Richard had worked in banking for over 2 decades and took pride in his position, but his pride was selective. To Richard, certain people didn't fit the clientele image he expected for his bank. At 2:45 p.m., the glass doors slid open, and Michael Grant walked inside. He was hard to miss. Tall, with broad shoulders, dark skin, and a posture that exuded quiet confidence. Michael wore a perfectly tailored navy blue suit, polished Italian shoes, and a subtle gold watch that caught the light with each step. He carried a sleek leather briefcase in one hand and a calm expression on his face. Richard noticed him immediately and felt his jaw tighten. He watched as Michael approached the front desk, his calm presence standing out in a space Richard subconsciously considered reserved. Without even realizing it, Richard's assumptions had taken root. Who does this guy think he is? Michael barely reached the counter when Richard strode out of his office, cutting him off. "May I help you, sir?" Richard asked, his tone cold but clipped with false politeness. Michael turned slightly, meeting Richard's gaze. He offered a polite smile. "Yes, I'd like to speak with the manager about a transfer. A large one." "I'm the branch manager," Richard said quickly as though testing him. "Do you have an account with us?" Michael nodded, reaching calmly into his jacket to pull out his bank card. "Yes, I've banked here for years. The account is under Michael Grant." He extended the card. Richard accepted it, though his fingers lingered slightly longer than necessary. He glanced down at the name, Michael Grant. The name rang a faint bell, but Richard dismissed it. There were plenty of clients here. Michael was no one special. And yet, Richard couldn't shake his unease. "All right, Mr. Grant," Richard said, handing the card back as though confirming its validity didn't mean much. "What kind of transfer are you talking about?" "A 7-figure transfer," Michael replied evenly, his tone casual yet firm. "I'm opening a new business account." Richard paused just slightly. His suspicion flared. 7 figures? From him? The words gnawed at Richard's preconceived ideas about Michael, but he quickly masked his discomfort with a forced smile. "I'll need verification of that," Richard said smoothly. "Large transactions like these require extensive documentation. I hope you understand. It's standard procedure." Michael raised an eyebrow. "Standard procedure?" His tone wasn't confrontational. He seemed to be searching for Richard's intent. "I've made similar transactions before. Never had an issue." Richard shrugged, adopting a sympathetic expression that didn't reach his eyes. "Well, we're extra cautious these days. Policies change." For a moment, Michael didn't speak. He stood there, steady and composed, his dark eyes fixed on Richard with an unsettling calm. Richard met his gaze but quickly looked away, pretending to sort papers on the counter. Around them, the bank continued to hum with activity. An older white couple at a teller station received smiles and efficient service. A younger white man in jeans and sneakers laughed with an employee, clearly familiar with the staff. No one asked them for extra documentation. Michael took in the scene, his quiet observation saying more than words ever could. "I see," Michael finally said, his voice soft but carrying weight. He adjusted the buttons on his suit jacket and picked up his briefcase. "In that case, I'll come back. But you may want to prepare for what comes next." Richard frowned, narrowing his eyes slightly. "Excuse me?" Michael offered him a calm, unreadable smile. "You'll see." With that, he turned and walked back through the glass doors, his footsteps slow and deliberate. He didn't raise his voice, didn't slam anything, he simply left, leaving behind an air of silent authority that lingered far longer than Richard expected. Back at his desk, Richard exhaled sharply, brushing off the unease in his chest. He muttered under his breath, probably bluffing. To him, Michael Grant was just another man pretending to be something he wasn't. At least, that's what Richard told himself. What Richard didn't realize, however, was that Michael Grant wasn't just any client. He was a well-known entrepreneur, investor, and one of the bank's largest private account holders. Michael was also someone with powerful connections and an ironclad memory for disrespect. As Richard sat smugly at his desk, unaware of the storm brewing, Michael Grant made a phone call in the privacy of his car. Calm as ever, he spoke only one sentence. It's time they learned who they're dealing with. The Horizon National Bank wasn't just any bank. It was a symbol of power and exclusivity in Atlanta. Its clientele ranged from wealthy retirees managing estates to up-and-coming entrepreneurs building their empires. The branch's grandiose design was a deliberate statement, with floor-to-ceiling windows, expensive modern art on the walls, and a marble floor polished to a mirror finish. For Richard Ward, managing this branch wasn't just a job. It was a declaration of his own importance. He believed in structure, rules, and tradition, but his idea of tradition was steeped in bias. Born and raised in a small town in the Deep South, Richard had grown up in a family where subtle racism was the norm. It wasn't the overt hostility of past generations. It was the quieter, insidious kind that lurked behind polite smiles and rigid standards. To Richard, Horizon wasn't just a place to work. It was a place to enforce those standards. He prided himself on knowing his customers, the kind of people he believed deserved the bank's attention. Those with a certain look or demeanor always seemed to get priority. This mindset had rarely been challenged. Over the years, Horizon had allowed him to climb the ladder without questioning the prejudices that influenced his decisions. For Richard, this was simply how the world worked, until Michael Grant walked in. Meanwhile, as Michael sat in his car outside the bank, he reflected on what had just happened. This wasn't the first time he'd faced discrimination, and he doubted it would be the last. Michael had grown up in Atlanta, in a modest but loving household where hard work and resilience were core values. His parents had always taught him to rise above ignorance, to maintain his composure no matter what the world threw at him. But Michael wasn't just a product of resilience. He was a product of ambition. Over the past 15 years, he had built a reputation as a savvy entrepreneur, turning a small tech startup into a multi-million-dollar empire. His company, Grant Innovations, was now a cornerstone of Atlanta's growing tech scene, and his success had opened doors into elite circles that were historically closed to men like him. Still, moments like these reminded him how little some things had changed. No amount of wealth, influence, or tailored suits could completely shield him from prejudice. Michael scrolled through his phone, pulling up a contact labeled Horizon HQ CEO. He hesitated for a moment, thinking about how many people Richard Ward's bias might have impacted. For Michael, this wasn't just about getting justice for himself. It was about exposing the quiet rot that still existed in places of power. Inside the bank, Richard returned to his office, where he found his assistant manager, Anna Lopez, waiting for him. Anna was in her early 30s, a hard-working and empathetic woman who had grown up in a diverse community in Miami. She had often felt uneasy about Richard's behavior, but had never been able to confront him directly. "Everything all right?" Anna asked cautiously, noticing the tension on Richard's face. "Fine," he snapped, sitting down at his desk. "Just another customer thinking they're entitled to special treatment." Anna hesitated, then asked, "Was that Mr. Grant? I think I've seen his name on some of the high-value accounts." Richard dismissed her with a wave of his hand. "If he's so important, he can prove it. I don't cater to people who think they can just walk in here and demand things without following procedure." Anna frowned but said nothing. She had worked with Richard long enough to know there was no reasoning with him once he'd made up his mind. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that this particular customer was someone Richard shouldn't have underestimated. As the day went on, Richard continued with his routine, oblivious to the fact that Michael's quiet departure had set off a chain reaction. Across town, Michael's call to Horizon's CEO, Deborah Langston, had already reached her ears. Deborah, a no-nonsense leader with a sharp mind and a deep commitment to inclusivity, immediately recognized Michael's name. She had personally approved his company's account years ago, aware of his significant contributions to the bank's bottom line. When Michael calmly explained what had happened, Deborah's tone turned icy. "He did what?" she asked, her voice sharp. Michael remained calm. "He made it very clear that my presence wasn't welcome. I've dealt with worse, Deborah, but this felt personal. I can't imagine I'm the only one he's treated this way." Deborah took a deep breath, her mind racing. Horizon prided itself on its reputation for excellence. But this wasn't the first complaint she'd received about Richard Ward. She had overlooked his past transgressions, chalking them up to misunderstandings. But this time was different. Michael Grant wasn't just a customer. He was one of the bank's largest individual investors, and his influence extended far beyond the financial world. "I'll handle it," Deborah promised, her voice firm. "I'm not looking for revenge," Michael said. "I just want accountability. Not for me, for everyone who walks into that branch." Deborah nodded, though Michael couldn't see her. "You have my word." Back at the branch, Richard was finishing his paperwork when his phone rang. Seeing Corporate HQ on the caller ID, he frowned and picked up. "Richard Ward speaking." "Richard, this is Deborah Langston," came the CEO's crisp voice. "I need to speak with you immediately about an incident involving Michael Grant." Richard's blood ran cold. "Michael Grant," he repeated, feigning ignorance. "Yes," Deborah said sharply. "He's a valued client and one of our top investors. From what I've heard, he didn't receive the respect he deserves, or the service we promise all of our customers. Care to explain?" Richard stammered, trying to piece together an excuse, but Deborah cut him off. "I suggest you think very carefully about what you say next. We'll be reviewing the footage and handling this matter with the utmost seriousness." For the first time in years, Richard felt a wave of panic. The next morning, Richard arrived at the Horizon National Bank feeling unusually unsettled. His conversation with Deborah Langston the previous evening lingered in his mind, but he had managed to convince himself that it wasn't as serious as it sounded. After all, he'd faced minor reprimands before and always came out unscathed. He had built a career on charm, excuses, and selective memory, and he didn't believe this time would be any different. But as he approached the bank's sleek entrance, something was off. Several unfamiliar faces, stern-looking corporate suits, were milling about the lobby. Richard's chest tightened. Inside, Anna was already at her desk, typing furiously on her computer. She glanced up as Richard entered, her face unusually tense. "Morning, Anna," he said, trying to sound casual. "What's going on here?" Anna hesitated. "Corporate sent an audit team. They arrived first thing this morning." Richard frowned. "An audit? Why?" Anna glanced around, lowering her voice. "They're here about yesterday." Richard stiffened. "Yesterday?" Anna gave him a knowing look. "Michael Grant, I think you underestimated who he is." Meanwhile, across town, Michael Grant was sitting in the boardroom of his company's headquarters. Through the large windows behind him, the Atlanta skyline gleamed under the morning sun. In front of him, several of his senior staff were briefing him on the latest developments in their projects. But Michael's focus was elsewhere. He had spoken with Deborah again earlier that morning. While she had assured him that Horizon was taking immediate steps to address the incident, Michael wanted more than promises. He wanted to make sure that systemic issues like this couldn't continue unchecked. "Gentlemen," Michael interrupted, closing his laptop, "that will be all for now. Let's pick this up after lunch." As his team left the room, Michael picked up his phone and made another call. This time it wasn't to Deborah. Back at the bank, the tension in the air was palpable. The audit team worked methodically, reviewing security footage, transaction logs, and employee records. Richard watched from his office, pretending to focus on his work, but unable to ignore the knot in his stomach. By noon, one of the auditors, a no-nonsense woman in her 40s named Karen Murphy, knocked on his office door. "Mr. Ward." "Yes, come in," Richard said, his voice betraying none of his inner anxiety. Karen stepped inside, holding a tablet and a clipboard. She sat down without waiting for an invitation. "We've reviewed the footage from yesterday," she began, her tone flat. "And we've spoken to several staff members about your handling of Michael Grant's visit." Richard straightened in his chair, his practiced managerial mask firmly in place. "I assure you, Ms. Murphy, I followed standard procedure." Karen raised an eyebrow. "Standard procedure? Is it standard procedure to dismiss a high-value client without verifying their account details, or to ignore the fact that Mr. Grant has been one of this branch's most loyal customers for over a decade?" Richard opened his mouth, but Karen held up a hand. "Spare me the excuses. I've heard them all before." She leaned forward, fixing Richard with a steely gaze. "Let me be clear. What happened yesterday wasn't just a lapse in judgment. It was a direct violation of our company's commitment to inclusivity and respect. Corporate is taking this very seriously." Richard's palms began to sweat. Look, I didn't realize who he was. If I'd known. That's exactly the problem, Karen interrupted. You shouldn't need to know who he is to treat him with respect. Every customer deserves the same level of professionalism, regardless of how they look or what you assume about them. Before Richard could respond, Karen stood. I suggest you think long and hard about your future here, Mr. Ward. We'll be in touch. As Karen left the office, Richard felt a chill run down his spine. For the first time, he realized that this situation might be slipping out of his control. Meanwhile, Michael was at a cafe near his office, meeting with a journalist from a prominent financial news outlet. The journalist, a sharp-eyed man in his early 30s named James Parker, had been following Michael's career for years and immediately jumped at the chance to meet. So, let me get this straight, James said, leaning forward. You walked into a branch of the bank where you're one of the largest investors, and the manager refused to assist you? Michael nodded, sipping his coffee. That's exactly what happened. James shook his head in disbelief. That's not just bad customer service, it's systemic bias. What are you hoping to achieve by going public with this? Michael's expression was calm but resolute. I'm not interested in tearing down Horizon Bank. What I want is accountability. For too long, people in positions like Richard's have been allowed to act on their biases without consequence. This isn't just about me. It's about every person who's been made to feel like they don't belong in places like that. James nodded, scribbling notes in his notebook. I can't promise how the public will react, but I can promise this story will get attention. That's all I ask, Michael said with a faint smile. By the end of the day, the first ripples of the story were already spreading. The financial news outlet published an article titled, Racism in Banking? Prominent Investor Speaks Out Against Discrimination. It detailed Michael's experience in the bank, subtly hinting at Richard Ward's actions without naming him directly. On social media, the article quickly gained traction, sparking debates about racism and privilege in the corporate world. Horizon Bank's official account issued a statement within hours, promising a full investigation and reaffirming their commitment to equality. For Richard, the day ended with a call from Deborah Langston herself. This time, there was no pretense of politeness. Richard, she said sharply, pack your things. You're done. The next morning, the once bustling Horizon National Bank branch was eerily quiet. Employees whispered to one another, stealing glances toward Richard's now empty office. By 9 a.m., word had spread through the building. Richard Ward had been terminated. A few staff members exchanged knowing looks, recalling moments when his behavior had bordered on inappropriate. Others, like Anna, felt a sense of justice but also unease about what this would mean for the future of the branch. Anna herself had been called into a meeting with the corporate audit team the previous evening. They had pressed her on Richard's conduct, asking whether his actions that day reflected a pattern. She had chosen her words carefully, wanting to be truthful without jeopardizing her own career. Richard often made assumptions about clients, she had said diplomatically. Sometimes those assumptions felt unfair. Yesterday wasn't the first time I noticed it, but it was the most blatant. The auditors had thanked her and moved on, but Anna couldn't shake the feeling that she'd said too much, or perhaps not enough. Elsewhere in the city, Michael Grant sat in his sleek home office, scrolling through the online response to the article about his experience. The reactions were as varied as he had expected. Some people expressed outrage, sharing their own experiences with discrimination in banks, stores, and workplaces. Others dismissed the issue entirely, accusing Michael of overreacting or pulling the race card. Michael wasn't surprised. He had seen this pattern before. What stood out, however, was the flood of messages from other black professionals who shared similar stories. Some had been denied loans despite stellar credit scores. Others had been questioned about the legitimacy of their accounts. One message from a woman named Kendra in Chicago read, "Thank you for speaking up. I've been a Horizon customer for years, but I've always felt invisible whenever I walk into my branch. Your story gave me the courage to file my own complaint." Michael leaned back in his chair, the weight of these stories pressing on him. What had happened to him wasn't unique. It was systemic. And now, with the platform he had, he felt an obligation to do more. At Horizon Bank's corporate headquarters, the fallout from Michael's experience was being felt at every level. Deborah Langston, the CEO, sat in a boardroom with her senior team. reviewing the damage control measures they had implemented over the past 24 hours. "We've issued a formal apology and committed to a full internal review," one of her advisors said, flipping through a PowerPoint presentation. "The social media backlash is strong, but it's contained for now." However, the article has sparked broader conversations about discrimination in banking, and we're seeing increased scrutiny from advocacy groups. Deborah nodded, her face grim. "This isn't just about salvaging our reputation," she said. "We need real change. Starting today, I want mandatory bias training for all branch managers and regional directors, and we need to strengthen our oversight processes to ensure incidents like this are flagged before they escalate." Another board member, an older man with a skeptical expression, cleared his throat. "With all due respect, Deborah, aren't we overreacting? This was one manager at one branch. Do we really need to overhaul the entire system because of a single mistake?" Deborah's eyes flashed. "This isn't an overreaction, it's an opportunity. If we don't address the root cause of these issues, we'll keep repeating the same mistakes. And next time, it might not be a client as gracious as Michael Grant." The room fell silent. Richard Ward, meanwhile, was sitting in his kitchen, staring blankly at the floor. The termination had been swift and humiliating. Security had escorted him out of the bank as though he were a criminal, his colleagues watching in stunned silence. He replayed the events in his mind, searching for someone else to blame. "I was just doing my job," he thought bitterly. "How was I supposed to know who he was?" But deep down, a part of him knew the truth. This wasn't just about Michael Grant. It was about a lifetime of prejudice that had gone unchecked. And now, for the first time, he was facing the consequences. His phone buzzed on the counter. It was a text from a former colleague. "Just saw the article. Rough break, man. Let me know if you need anything." Richard grimaced. The article had spread farther than he realized. He opened his laptop, typing "Michael Grant Horizon Bank" into the search bar. The headlines were everywhere. He scrolled through the comments, each one a gut punch. He got what he deserved. About time banks started holding people accountable. Imagine how many others he's treated like this. Richard slammed the laptop shut, anger bubbling in his chest. As the days passed, Michael's story continued to spark conversations nationwide. Advocacy groups began calling for greater accountability in banking, pushing for transparency around how customers were treated. Horizon Bank announced a series of new initiatives, including a partnership with Michael Grant to develop programs promoting financial equity. At a press conference a week later, Michael stood alongside Deborah Langston as they unveiled the Access for All initiative. The program would provide resources and training to underserved communities while holding banking professionals accountable for biased practices. During the Q&A session, a reporter asked Michael, "What motivated you to take this issue public instead of handling it privately?" Michael paused, choosing his words carefully. "This was never just about me," he said. "What happened to me was a symptom of a larger problem, one that affects thousands, maybe millions of people every day. I went public because I believe in using my platform to create change, and because I know what it feels like to be judged unfairly, not for who you are, but for what people assume about you." The room fell quiet, Michael's words resonating deeply. Back at the bank branch, Anna had taken over as interim manager. She implemented immediate changes, starting with team meetings to address customer service practices. Though the road ahead was uncertain, Anna felt hopeful. For the first time, it seemed like the bank was truly committed to making things right. 2 weeks after the press conference, the momentum surrounding Michael's story showed no signs of slowing down. The Access for All initiative had drawn national attention, with headlines praising Michael's decision to partner with Horizon Bank rather than abandon them altogether. Deborah Langston's leadership was commended for taking swift action, but the spotlight continued to shine brightest on Michael. Despite the positive reception, Michael knew there was still work to be done. He had agreed to serve as an advisor to the bank's new equity and inclusion programs, but his involvement came with strings attached. He wanted to see measurable results, more accountability for branch managers, transparency in banking policies, and an outreach program for underserved communities. Michael's assistant, Carla, knocked on his office door as he reviewed reports on the bank's progress. "Michael, you've got a visitor," she said, her tone cautious. Michael glanced up. "Who is it?" Carla hesitated. "Richard Ward." Michael froze, his expression unreadable. "Let him in." Moments later, Richard walked into the office. his shoulders hunched and his usual air of superiority noticeably absent. He looked like a shadow of the man who had dismissed Michael so casually weeks earlier. "Mr. Grant," Richard began, his voice low. "Thank you for agreeing to see me." Michael gestured to a chair. "Have a seat." Richard sat down, fidgeting with his hands. For a moment there was silence. Then he spoke. "I came here to apologize," he said, his voice trembling slightly. I made assumptions about you that day. Assumptions I had no right to make. And I know there's nothing I can say to undo the damage I caused." Michael studied him carefully, his face unreadable. "Why now?" he asked. "Why not 2 weeks ago when the story broke, or the day after it happened?" Richard swallowed hard. "At first, I didn't think I needed to. I told myself it was just a misunderstanding, that I was just following protocol. But the truth is, I was wrong. And seeing the fallout, seeing how many people came forward with their own stories, I realized this wasn't just about me. It's about a system I've been part of for years, a system I helped perpetuate." Michael leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. "And what do you want from me, Richard? Forgiveness? Redemption?" Richard shook his head. "I'm not here to ask for anything. I just needed to face you and admit my mistakes. For what it's worth, I've started attending bias training on my own. I know it's just a first step, but—" He trailed off, unsure of what else to say. For a long moment, Michael said nothing. Then finally, he spoke. "Change doesn't happen overnight, Richard. Apologies are a start, but what really matters is what you do moving forward." Richard nodded, his face lined with regret. "Thank you for hearing me out," he said quietly, rising to leave. As he reached the door, Michael stopped him. "Richard," he said, his voice firm, "you've got a long way to go, but if you're serious about change, there's a training program launching next month through the initiative. You should sign up." Richard turned, surprise flashing across his face. "I will," he said before walking out the door. Later that week, Michael met with Deborah Langston to discuss the next phase of the initiative. They sat in her corner office overlooking downtown Atlanta, sipping coffee as they reviewed the latest data. "Branch audits have uncovered more instances of bias," Deborah said, sliding a report across the table. "We've already begun disciplinary action against a few managers, but we're also seeing opportunities for improvement." Michael scanned the report, nodding. "This is a good start, but we need to make sure the changes stick. That means more than just firing people. It means changing the culture." Deborah sighed. "It's a long road ahead, but I'm committed to seeing it through, and I have you to thank for pushing us in the right direction." Michael smiled faintly. "Accountability is just the first step. The real challenge is rebuilding trust." As they spoke, another news article about the initiative went live online. The headline read, "Turning the Tide: How One Man's Stand Against Discrimination Sparked a Movement in Banking." For Richard, the turning point came in a different form. After his meeting with Michael, he couldn't stop thinking about the weight of his actions. His dismissal from Horizon had been a wake-up call, forcing him to confront parts of himself he had long ignored. He started attending workshops on unconscious bias and volunteered with local organizations focused on racial equity. At first, his efforts felt awkward and performative, but over time he began to understand the deeper systemic issues at play. He also started reaching out to former colleagues, asking for honest feedback about his behavior over the years. Many were hesitant to respond, but Anna Lopez surprised him with a candid email. "You've hurt a lot of people, Richard," she wrote. "But if you're serious about change, actions will speak louder than words. Start by listening." Richard read the email twice, her words echoing in his mind. Meanwhile, the public response to the Access for All initiative continued to grow. Several other banks announced similar programs, citing Horizon's efforts as inspiration. Michael's decision to stay involved with the bank rather than cutting ties was seen as a bold move, proving that change was possible, even within flawed systems. For Michael, the turning point wasn't just about transforming Horizon. It was about using his influence to create a ripple effect across the industry. He knew the journey was far from over, but for the first time, he felt like real progress was within reach. The weeks following Richard's termination and the launch of the Access for All initiative were transformative for Horizon National Bank. Internally, the culture began to shift as employees across branches participated in bias training and workshops designed to uncover and address systemic inequities. While some employees embraced the changes, Others resisted, feeling the training was unnecessary or overly critical. Anna Lopez, now the acting manager of the downtown branch, took the opportunity to lead by example. She made it a point to hold regular staff meetings, where employees were encouraged to share their experiences and concerns without fear of retaliation. For the first time, conversations about bias and equity were happening openly within the branch. One day, Anna overheard a conversation between two tellers at the lunchroom table. "It's crazy," one of them said, scrolling through her phone. "I had no idea how much bias played into our daily interactions with customers. I thought we were treating everyone equally." The other nodded, looking thoughtful. "Yeah, me too. But after that training, I realized how often I make assumptions without even meaning to. It's eye-opening." Anna smiled to herself, feeling a glimmer of hope. For Michael Grant, the fallout from his decision to go public was both rewarding and exhausting. On one hand, the overwhelming support from advocacy groups and individuals inspired him to keep pushing for change. On the other, the criticism from skeptics and trolls on social media weighed on him more than he cared to admit. One evening, he sat in his home office, scrolling through the comments on a recent article about the initiative. Among the supportive messages, there were plenty of dismissive ones. "Just another rich guy looking for attention. Banks don't need diversity, they need profits. This whole thing is blown out of proportion." Michael sighed, leaning back in his chair. He reminded himself that change was never easy, and that resistance was a natural part of progress. Still, he couldn't help but wonder how many people truly understood what he was trying to achieve. A text from his assistant, Carla, interrupted his thoughts. "FYI, your speech at next week's Equity Summit has been confirmed. They're expecting 500 attendees." Michael smiled faintly, grateful for the opportunity to keep the conversation going. Across town, Richard Ward's life had taken a dramatic turn. For the first time in decades, he was unemployed, with no clear path forward. The savings he had accumulated over his career provided a financial cushion, but the loss of his professional identity left a void he didn't know how to fill. Richard spent his days attending workshops and volunteering at local nonprofits, as he had promised Michael he would. At first, he approached these activities with a sense of obligation, but over time, something began to shift. One day, Richard found himself at a community center, helping a group of teenagers with mock job interviews. A young black boy named Jamal sat across from him, nervously tugging at the collar of his borrowed suit. "Tell me about yourself," Richard said, trying to sound approachable. Jamal hesitated. I'm Jamal, and I want to be an engineer someday." "That's a good start," Richard said, nodding. "But let's try again with more confidence. Say it like you believe it." Jamal straightened in his chair, his voice a little stronger this time. "I'm Jamal, and I will be an engineer someday." Richard smiled, something inside him softening. For the first time, he saw his work at the community center not as penance, but as an opportunity to make a real difference. The media's focus on Horizon Bank and the Access for All initiative continued to intensify. National news outlets picked up the story, praising Michael Grant's leadership and calling on other industries to follow suit. Horizon even saw a modest uptick in new accounts as customers flocked to support a bank that was actively addressing discrimination. However, not all the feedback was positive. Conservative pundits criticized the initiative as performative and accused Horizon of pandering to social justice movements. Michael took these criticisms in stride, refusing to let them distract from the work at hand. "Change is always met with resistance," he said during an interview on a national news program. "What matters is staying committed to the cause, even when it's uncomfortable." For Richard, the consequences of his actions were far more personal. His dismissal from Horizon had alienated him from many of his former colleagues, and his reputation within the banking industry was in tatters. Attempts to apply for new positions were met with polite rejections, and his LinkedIn messages went unanswered. One evening, Richard sat alone in his modest home, scrolling through job listings on his laptop. His pride kept him from reaching out to old connections, but the reality of his situation was becoming harder to ignore. Suddenly, his phone buzzed with a notification. It was an email from Horizon Bank, informing him that the Access for All training program he had enrolled in was starting the following week. For a moment, he considered deleting the email, but then he thought of Michael's words during their meeting. Change doesn't happen overnight. What matters is what you do moving forward. With a deep breath, Richard clicked the registration link and signed up. As the months passed, the effects of the initiative began to ripple beyond Horizon Bank. Other financial institutions announced similar programs, inspired by the progress Horizon had made. Michael became a sought-after speaker at industry conferences, using his platform to advocate for systemic change. During a panel discussion at a major summit, a fellow speaker asked Michael, "Do you think this is enough? Can one initiative really make a difference?" Michael paused, his expression thoughtful. "One initiative can't fix everything," he admitted, "but it can start a conversation. It can challenge assumptions and create opportunities for people to see the world and each other differently. That's how change begins." For Richard, the process of rebuilding his life was slow and humbling. But as he continued his training and volunteer work, he began to see the world through a new lens. He still had a long way to go, but for the first time, he felt a glimmer of hope, not just for himself, but for the future he was helping to create. Months after the public fallout, Michael Grant's name had become synonymous with progress in the banking world. His partnership with Horizon Bank had not only sparked industry-wide discussions, but also tangible changes. Through the Access for All initiative, over 50 branches across the country had implemented programs to foster equity and inclusivity, with many more on track to follow. Despite these strides, Michael knew the work was far from over. Sitting in his office late one evening, he reviewed reports detailing the initiative's impact. While there were plenty of success stories, like a rural branch in Alabama seeing a 25% increase in minority clients, other reports highlighted resistance. Some managers had quietly resigned rather than embrace the changes, while a handful of employees had filed complaints against the mandatory training sessions. Carla, his assistant, knocked lightly on the door, breaking his concentration. "Michael, I know you're busy, but you've got a video call with the Advocacy Coalition in 5 minutes." Michael nodded, closing his laptop. "Thanks, Carla. I'll join shortly." As the call began, Michael was greeted by a dozen faces from various advocacy organizations. They discussed the progress made so far and the challenges ahead. One participant, a passionate young woman from Chicago, raised a concern. "Mr. Grant, we've seen great results in larger cities, but what about smaller communities? Some of the most vulnerable people don't even trust banks because of past discrimination. How do we reach them?" Michael leaned forward, his expression thoughtful. "You're right. We need to go beyond the walls of the bank. Outreach programs, community events, even partnerships with local leaders. These are the steps that build trust. Let's set up a task force to focus on these areas." The group nodded in agreement, and the conversation shifted to logistics. For Michael, this was the essence of leadership, not just addressing immediate problems, but building systems that could sustain long-term change. Meanwhile, Richard Ward's journey toward personal growth continued. After completing the initial Access for All training program, he enrolled in a mentorship program at a nonprofit focused on workplace equity. The sessions were uncomfortable at first, forcing him to confront his biases and acknowledge the harm he had caused. One evening during a group discussion, the facilitator asked each participant to share a moment in their lives when they realized they had been wrong. When it was Richard's turn, he hesitated, but finally spoke. "There was a man who came into my branch," he began, his voice unsteady. "He was calm, professional, respectful, but I judged him based on his appearance. I didn't treat him like the valued client he was, and it cost me everything: my job, my reputation, my sense of self. But more importantly, it cost him his dignity." The room was silent as Richard spoke. For the first time, he didn't feel defensive or self-pitying. Instead, he felt a strange sense of relief. After the session, one of the younger participants approached him. "That was brave of you," she said. "I think a lot of us have been on the other side of that judgment. It means something that you're here trying to change." Richard thanked her, feeling a flicker of hope he hadn't felt in months. At Horizon Bank's headquarters, Deborah Langston continued to push for systemic change. She had recently appointed Anna Lopez as the permanent manager of the downtown branch, citing her leadership during the fallout as a key factor. Anna's first major project was organizing a community financial literacy event aimed at bridging the gap between the bank and underserved populations. She invited Michael to speak at the event, knowing his presence would inspire trust and credibility. On the day of the event, the branch was buzzing with activity. Families, young professionals, and retirees from all walks of life filled the lobby, engaging in workshops and one-on-one consultations. When it was Michael's turn to speak, he stood in front of the crowd, his presence commanding yet approachable. "I grew up not far from here," he began. "Back then I didn't know much about banking or investing. I just knew that opportunities weren't evenly distributed, and for people like me, the system often felt like it wasn't built for us. But I'm here to tell you that things can change. With the right tools and support, we can all have a seat at the table." The audience erupted in applause, and Michael spent the rest of the event mingling with attendees, answering questions, and listening to their stories. For Richard, the event was a turning point in a different way. Though no longer employed by Horizon, he had been invited by Anna to attend as a volunteer. It was his first time back at the branch since his termination, and walking through those glass doors again felt surreal. As he helped distribute brochures and direct attendees to workshops, he noticed Michael across the room, speaking with a young couple. A wave of shame and gratitude washed over him. At the end of the event, Richard approached Michael cautiously. "Mr. Grant," he began, his voice steady but humble. "I just wanted to say thank you, not just for giving me a second chance, but for showing me how much I still have to learn." Michael regarded him for a moment, then extended his hand. "It's about progress, not perfection, Richard. Keep going." As they shook hands, Richard felt a sense of closure and a new beginning. In the months that followed, the Access for All initiative expanded into new territories, setting a standard for equity in the financial industry. Michael continued to advocate for systemic change, balancing his corporate influence with grassroots efforts. For Richard, redemption was a slow but steady process. Though he remained out of the banking world, his volunteer work and personal growth brought him a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. And for the thousands of people impacted by the initiative, Horizon National Bank became more than just a financial institution. It became a symbol of what was possible when people refused to accept the status quo. 6 months after the launch of the Access for All initiative, the financial industry was buzzing with conversations about equity. Horizon National Bank had become a case study in corporate accountability, with other institutions scrambling to implement similar programs. Michael Grant's name was now synonymous with progress, but his work was far from done. Sitting in his corner office, Michael reviewed the results of a recent nationwide survey on trust in the banking system. The numbers were mixed. While trust had increased among some demographics, others, particularly in rural and low-income areas, still expressed skepticism. Carla entered with her usual efficiency, carrying a stack of folders. "Michael, we've got a problem," she said, placing the files on his desk. Michael raised an eyebrow. "What's going on?" She handed him one of the folders. "It's a report from the Rural Outreach Program. Some of the branches are pushing back against the new policies. A few managers are even refusing to participate in the training sessions." Michael's jaw tightened. Resistance was expected, but outright refusal was unacceptable. "Which branches?" Carla hesitated. "One of the worst offenders is the Brentwood branch in Alabama. The manager's been sending complaints directly to corporate, claiming the program is a distraction from the bank's real goals." Michael leaned back in his chair, his mind already working. The Brentwood branch served a predominantly black community, one that had historically been underserved and exploited by financial institutions. If the manager was resisting change, it wasn't just a policy issue. It was a systemic failure that needed immediate attention. "Schedule a meeting with Deborah," Michael said firmly. "I'll fly down to Brentwood myself if I have to." Across town, Richard Ward was experiencing a quiet transformation. Since volunteering at the community center and completing his training, he had begun to rebuild his life in unexpected ways. He now worked part-time for a nonprofit focused on financial literacy, helping underserved communities gain access to banking and credit. One afternoon, while leading a workshop on budgeting, Richard noticed a familiar face in the audience. It was Jamal, the young boy he had mentored during the mock interviews months earlier. After the session, Jamal approached him with a wide grin. "Mr. Ward, I got into that engineering program I told you about." Richard felt a surge of pride. "That's incredible, Jamal. You worked hard for it. You earned it." Jamal nodded, his enthusiasm infectious. And the budgeting tips you gave me? They're helping my mom too. She's saving for the first time in years. For Richard, moments like this were more rewarding than any paycheck he had ever earned at the bank. Meanwhile, back at Horizon Bank headquarters, Deborah Langston was reviewing the situation in Brentwood with her senior team. Michael had arrived early for the meeting, his frustration evident. "This isn't just a policy violation," Michael said, pointing to the report. "It's a complete disregard for the people we're supposed to serve. If we allow this kind of behavior to continue, we're undermining everything the initiative stands for." Deborah nodded. "I agree, but we need to handle this carefully. Terminating the manager outright could spark backlash, especially in a community that's already wary of us." Michael leaned forward, his tone resolute. "Then we need to show them that we're serious about change. I want to visit the Brentwood branch in person. Let me talk to the staff and the community. If the manager won't get on board, we'll deal with that afterward." Deborah hesitated but eventually nodded. "All right, but take Anna with you. Her leadership at the downtown branch has been invaluable, and her perspective could help." The visit to Brentwood was arranged within days. Michael and Anna flew down together, spending the first afternoon meeting with the branch staff. As expected, the manager, a middle-aged man named Tom Harper, was less than welcoming. "I appreciate what you're trying to do," Tom said, his tone dripping with condescension. "But these programs don't really apply here. Our customers aren't interested in workshops or training. They just want us to handle their transactions and move on." Michael kept his composure. "With all due respect, Mr. Harper, it's not your place to decide what the community needs. Have you even asked them?" Tom bristled, but didn't respond. Anna stepped in. "We're hosting a community event tomorrow to hear directly from the people you serve. I suggest you attend. You might learn something." The next day, the community center in Brentwood was packed. Residents of all ages had come to share their experiences with the bank and learn more about the new programs. Michael listened attentively as people described years of neglect and frustration. "Every time I come into the branch, they treat me like I'm wasting their time," said an older woman named Mrs. Carter. "I've been banking there for 20 years, but they still act like I don't belong." A young man added, "I tried to get a small business loan last year, and they turned me down without even explaining why. Said my credit wasn't good enough, but I never missed a payment in my life." Michael glanced at Anna, who was furiously taking notes. Tom Harper sat at the back of the room, his expression growing more uncomfortable with each story. When it was Michael's turn to speak, he addressed the crowd with his usual calm authority. "I hear you," he said, "and I promise you things are going to change. Not just here in Brentwood, but across every community Horizon serves. We're committed to earning back your trust." The audience erupted in applause, their skepticism softening into cautious optimism. Later that evening, Michael received an unexpected visitor at his hotel. It was Tom Harper. "I need to apologize," Tom said, looking genuinely contrite. "I didn't realize how deep the problems ran here. Hearing those stories today, it opened my eyes." Michael studied him for a moment, then nodded. "It's not too late to make things right, Tom, but it starts with you." By the time Michael and Anna returned to Atlanta, the Brentwood branch was already implementing changes. Tom Harper had agreed to stay on under close supervision, committing to rebuilding trust with the community. For Michael, the experience reinforced an important lesson. Change wasn't just about policies, it was about people. And sometimes the hardest part was convincing others to see what was right in front of them. Months of hard work culminated in Horizon National Bank's first annual Access for All Summit, held in Atlanta's largest convention center. The event was a landmark moment, with community leaders, industry professionals, and advocacy groups coming together to celebrate progress and address the challenges ahead. Michael Grant was the keynote speaker, his name now synonymous with equity in finance. The main hall buzzed with energy as hundreds of attendees settled into their seats. Panels throughout the day had featured discussions on topics ranging from community outreach to systemic reform, but everyone was waiting for Michael's speech. Backstage, Michael adjusted his tie, his mind racing with the weight of the moment. This wasn't just another speech. It was a chance to solidify the changes he had fought so hard to implement. Carla appeared at his side, her clipboard in hand. "They're ready for you," she said with a reassuring smile. Michael nodded, taking a deep breath before stepping onto the stage. The spotlight illuminated Michael as he stood behind the podium, the vast audience falling silent. He began with a story, as he often did, a personal account of walking into Horizon's downtown branch months ago and being dismissed without cause. That day could have ended differently, he said, his voice steady. I could have left angry, vowing never to return. I could have taken my business elsewhere. But instead I saw an opportunity, a chance to address a problem that goes far beyond one branch, one bank, or one manager. He paused, letting the words sink in. What happened to me is part of a much larger issue, a system that has long overlooked and undervalued certain communities. But today, I'm standing here because change is possible. We've seen it in Horizon's branches, in the communities we've served, and in the people who've stepped up to make things right. The audience erupted in applause, but Michael raised his hand to quiet them. Let me be clear, this is only the beginning. True equity requires more than policy changes. It requires a shift in culture, in perspective, and in action. And that's not something any one person can do alone. It takes all of us. The room stood in a standing ovation, but Michael wasn't finished. To everyone here, I challenge you. Ask yourselves what you can do, not tomorrow, not next year, but today, to make this system more fair, more inclusive, and more just. Because change isn't a destination, it's a journey. In the audience, Richard Ward sat in the back row, listening intently. He had debated attending the summit, unsure of whether he deserved to be there. But Michael's invitation had been clear. Come, listen, and learn. As Michael spoke, Richard felt a pang of guilt, but also determination. His termination had been the hardest moment of his life, but it had also been a wake-up call. Since then, he had immersed himself in learning and unlearning, acknowledging the harm he had caused and working to make amends. When the speech ended, Richard stood with the rest of the audience, clapping until his hands ached. After the summit, Michael mingled with attendees, answering questions and posing for photos. Near the end of the evening, he spotted Richard lingering by the exit. "Richard," Michael called, walking over. Richard turned, his expression a mix of surprise and gratitude. "Michael, that was incredible. Thanks," Michael said, offering a small smile. "How have you been?" Richard hesitated, then answered honestly. "It's been a tough road, but I'm trying. Volunteering, learning, listening. I still have a lot of work to do, but I'm committed." Michael nodded, his expression thoughtful. "That's all anyone can ask for. Progress, not perfection." Richard extended his hand and Michael shook it firmly. "Thank you," Richard said, "for giving me a chance to change." "It's not about giving chances," Michael replied. "It's about holding people accountable and giving them the tools to grow." As the summit wrapped up, the ripple effects of Michael's work were already evident. Horizon National Bank announced a $10 million fund to support financial literacy programs in underserved communities, along with scholarships for minority students pursuing careers in finance. Michael's story was broadcast across the country, inspiring other industries to examine their own practices. But for Michael, the real victory wasn't in the headlines or the applause. It was in the quiet, steady progress being made every day in branches like Brentwood and downtown Atlanta. Late that night, as Michael returned to his home, he received an email from a Horizon employee he didn't recognize. The subject line read, "Thank you." Michael opened it to find a heartfelt message from a teller in a small-town branch. "I wanted to thank you for what you've done. I didn't realize how much bias influenced the way I saw people until I attended the training sessions. It's changed how I do my job and how I see the world." Michael smiled, closing his laptop. He knew the road ahead would be long, but moments like these reminded him why the journey was worth it. The weeks following the Access for All Summit solidified the initiative as a pivotal moment in Horizon National Bank's history. Media coverage of the event painted a picture of progress and accountability, with Michael Grant positioned as a leader who had transformed an industry through persistence and vision. Horizon's internal audits revealed that the program was making a measurable difference. Client satisfaction scores in branches participating in the initiative had risen significantly, particularly in communities that had historically faced neglect. Employees were reporting better relationships with customers, and the bank's recruitment of diverse talent had doubled. For Michael, the success of the initiative was gratifying, but he refused to let it become a stopping point. He continued to work closely with Deborah Langston, holding monthly strategy meetings to track the initiative's progress and ensure the bank remained accountable. One afternoon, during a meeting with Deborah, she set her pen down and leaned back in her chair. "You've done something remarkable here, Michael," she said. "This isn't just a win for Horizon. It's a win for the entire industry." Michael smiled faintly, but his response was measured. "This was never about winning, Deborah. It's about changing the game entirely." She nodded, understanding his meaning. "Well, just know that Horizon is fully committed to seeing this through. You have my word." Michael left the meeting feeling hopeful, but grounded. He knew the work was far from finished, and that lasting change would require constant vigilance. For Richard Ward, the road to redemption was slow but transformative. After months of volunteering, mentoring, and attending equity workshops, he found himself feeling a sense of purpose he hadn't known before. He had recently accepted a role as a program coordinator at the nonprofit where he had been volunteering, helping underserved communities access financial resources. One day, while leading a workshop, Richard ran into Anna Lopez, who had come to observe the session as part of Horizon's outreach efforts. "Richard," Anna said, approaching him after the session ended, "I have to admit I wasn't sure if you'd stick with this, but I'm glad to see you've proven me wrong." Richard chuckled, a mix of humility and gratitude in his expression. "I'm just trying to do the right thing now, Anna. Took me long enough to figure out what that was." She smiled. Better late than never. As she left, Richard couldn't help but feel a small sense of pride. For the first time, he was making a difference, not through power or authority, but through understanding and empathy. Horizon National Bank, under Deborah's leadership and Michael's guidance, became a symbol of how corporations could address systemic bias. The changes implemented through the Access for All initiative set new industry standards, inspiring other financial institutions to follow suit. Community branches like the one in Brentwood saw tangible improvements. Residents who had once felt ignored now reported being treated with respect, and small business loan approvals increased by 30% in underserved areas. Late one evening, Michael sat on the balcony of his home, overlooking the Atlanta skyline. The lights of the city twinkled like 1,000 small promises, and Michael allowed himself a rare moment of stillness. He thought about the journey that had brought him here, the indignity of being dismissed at the bank, the choice to speak out, and the relentless work that had followed. In the end, it wasn't about him. It was about the people who would walk into a bank tomorrow, next year, or 10 years from now and be treated with the respect they deserved, regardless of who they were. Michael's phone buzzed with a notification. It was another email from a Horizon employee, thanking him for inspiring change. He smiled, knowing the road ahead would always have challenges. But for the first time, he felt certain that the work was moving in the right direction. A year after the launch of the Access for All initiative, Horizon National Bank hosted a small private ceremony at its headquarters to commemorate the program's first anniversary. It wasn't a flashy event, just a gathering of the people who had played pivotal roles in its success. Michael Grant stood at the front of the room, watching as employees, community leaders, and even former skeptics mingled and shared stories of transformation. Anna Lopez approached him, holding 2 glasses of champagne. "You've done something incredible here," she said, handing him one of the glasses. Michael smiled, raising his glass. "We've done something incredible. This was never a solo effort." As they clinked glasses, Michael's gaze shifted to the far corner of the room, where Richard Ward was standing. Though hesitant, Richard had accepted the invitation to attend, knowing it was a chance to reflect on the journey he had taken. Michael caught his eye and nodded, a silent acknowledgement of the progress they had both made. Richard nodded back, gratitude etched in his expression. Later that evening, as the event wound down, Deborah Langston took the stage to deliver a closing speech. "This initiative started as a response to one man's courage," she said, glancing at Michael. "But it's grown into something much bigger. It's a testament to what's possible when we acknowledge our flaws, take accountability, and commit to doing better. Here's to continuing that journey." The room erupted in applause, the sound carrying a sense of unity and hope. As the guests left the ceremony and the lights dimmed, Michael lingered for a moment, looking out over the city skyline from the balcony of Horizon's headquarters. Behind him, Carla walked up quietly. "Ready to head out?" she asked. Michael turned and smiled. "Yeah, let's go." The two walked toward the elevator, the sound of their footsteps fading into the quiet night. Somewhere out there, another challenge was waiting, but for now, Michael felt at peace. The fight wasn't over, but progress had been made, and that was enough to keep him moving forward. This story is more than just a narrative. It's a reminder of the power of accountability, courage, and the willingness to change. The journey of Michael Grant, Richard Ward, and Horizon National Bank reflects struggles that happen in workplaces, communities, and institutions every day. We invite you to think about your own role in fostering fairness and inclusivity. Whether it's speaking up against bias, mentoring someone from an underrepresented background, or simply listening to stories different from your own, every action counts. Share this story with someone who might need to hear it, and let's keep the conversation alive. What can you do today to make your community, workplace, or industry more equitable? Change begins with each of us.